Welcome, everyone, to episode number 15 of EV Society's Canada Talks Electric Cars webinar. And my name's Tim Burrows. I'm going to be the moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar topic is the politics of electrification in Canada. And to inform us on this topic, we're welcoming Dr. Nathan Lemphers. Nathan is a postdoctoral fellow at the Smart Prosperity Institute in Ottawa. The Institute is dedicated to realizing a thriving economy and a healthy environment for Canadians, achieved through decoupling environmental harm from economic success. His research examines the politics and policy of electric vehicles and the impact that this new technology will have on regional economies. In 2019, Nathan was awarded his doctorate from the University of Toronto's Department of Political Science. His doctoral research examined the climate politics of three major fossil fuel exporting countries: Australia, Canada, and Norway. Nathan has been a senior campaigner at Oil Change International, where he advocated for reform at the International Energy Agency, and a senior policy analyst at the Pembina Institute, where he worked on oil sands and pipeline policy issues. He has co-chaired the University of Toronto's Responsible Investment Committee and sat on the Community of Interest panel of the Mining Association of Canada's Towards Sustainable Mining program. Nathan also holds a Master's of City Planning from MIT and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Alberta. Hey, Nathan, welcome to Canada Talks webinar.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. So I know we see that we have a great audience tonight or this afternoon, depending on where they're dialing in from, right across Canada. And I think your talk tonight's going to be touching on aspects for all listeners. So yeah, we welcome you aboard. And at this point, I'm just going to turn the microphone and the camera over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Tim. All right, so I'll get started. So thanks, Tim, for the introduction. As you mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Smart Prosperity Institute, which is actually based in the University of Ottawa. Today, I'm going to be talking about the politics of electrification in Canada, electrification of transport. The goals for my talk are to help you to better understand how politics shapes the transition to electric vehicles and electrified transport writ large, and also to learn perhaps a few more strategic or practical things of how to help accelerate this transition and to make it more just. And I've noticed from previous webinar series at the Electric Vehicle Society that there's been a lot of great expertise shared around the technology of electric vehicles and around the policies. I'm going to be focusing more on the politics, so less on the sort of rules setting and market setting, and more on some of the background stories and coalitions. And that's going to be the basis for most of my talk. I'll start off with a bit of a context, but then I'll get into the politics of coalitions and also the politics of ideas and the power of stories and how that shapes who wins and who loses and how quickly from electrification of transportation in Canada. And the particular aspects of EV politics that I'm talking about is just a narrow window. So I'm happy to answer or field questions on other areas of electric vehicle politics as well, in particular regional nuances that I might not have time to cover in my presentation. So as a background, you all know that, especially in the last few years, there's rapid change going about in the electric vehicle space. Technology is rapidly accelerating. You're seeing over the last 30 years, a 98% decrease in the cost of batteries. And from most projections, some projections are saying that EVs will achieve the mystical parity with combustion engine vehicles at $100 per kilowatt hour within the next few years. Meanwhile, companies across the electric vehicle value chain for passenger transportation are pivoting. You're seeing mineral mining companies changing how they talk and how they mine with regards to supplying the minerals needed for electric vehicles. You're seeing auto part companies change, OEMs, and manufacturers of other vehicles like buses starting to appear or to retool towards electrification. Meanwhile, public opinion is rapidly changing. I'm not sure if you were able to see the KPMG polling from earlier this year. I think it came out in February that asked Canadians what's the likelihood of you being able to purchase an electric vehicle over the next 5 years, and 70% of Canadians said that they would be willing to purchase an electric vehicle, which is compared to historical polling in that area, light years ahead of what it was even just before the pandemic. Meanwhile, public policy, which sets the rules of the game, is also changing rapidly. And that really depends on the particular region that you're in. If you look federally, just last month, or almost last month, the end of June, there was the big federal announcement for mandatory 100% ZEV mandate by 2035. So this changed from a voluntary approach and a 2040 deadline, so that now they're aligned with jurisdictions like California and Quebec, but on a national scale. You see automakers fully announcing plans to fully electrify, even automakers that were slow or recalcitrant at first, announcing that they would cease R&D in combustion engine vehicles and announce and roll out fully electrified vehicle platforms by 2030. The latest major player was Mercedes-Benz just a week or two ago. Meanwhile, you're having even the fossil fuel companies announce that they're net zero, and they're trying to grab a piece of the net zero future by saying that they'll switch to decarbonized or offset or renewable sources of fuel for transportation or other uses. And whether that's real or imagined, that's a conversation for a different webinar. But the fact is that they're spending political capital and advertising dollars in making this particular change. And that's something that's unprecedented, at least over the last decade or so. So that's the context. If I could skip right to the punchline of my talk of how to navigate the politics of electrification, I would argue that if you want the transition to be swift and just, there needs to be a better use of the power of stories and coalitions, and that if the power of those stories and those coalitions can be harnessed, it can create these virtuous cycles where public policy that's informed by these coalitions and corporate decisions and household choices that are informed by these stories and coalitions can help propagate even faster and broader uptake of electric vehicles across the country. So I'm talking about the politics behind these corporate and public policy decisions that are being announced, and how to hasten that and make sure that no one gets left behind. So as a lens for my talk and my analysis is this diagram. This comes from the federal government, from their sex and gender-based analysis plus initiative that they've started to do for federal budgeting and broader public policy that they're rolling out in Ottawa. And this diagram, I think, is instructive for the politics of many trying to advance public policy in Canada, that you need to understand that there's just not one homogenized, essentialized Canada, that there's many diverse Canadas out there, and it breaks down on sex and gender lines. It breaks down along age, religion, language, geography, culture, income, sexual orientation, education, ethnicity, and ability. and that to understand the politics, to make it more just and swift, advocates and EV enthusiasts need to be able to understand how these different things intersect with the politics of electric vehicles. They each carry implications for the stories that we tell about electric vehicles and the coalitions that operate, and the power that they convey as well. If there's a large population left out of the equation, whether through stories or coalitions, or if they're painted in a certain light, it could isolate or neutralize, which could be a good or bad thing depending on what your sort of position in the advocacy solar system is. All right, so old stories. Stories are all around us. They're floating in the ether. They consist of ideas and norms and narratives, but we often take them for granted. They just are naturally assumed for a lot of people who have spent time in a particular region or a particular community. They're the thing that everyone can agree on. Stories in Canada's a nation of hockey players, because we're a hardy folk and who like to enjoy the cold winters. For Alberta, where I grew up, there's a story that it's a place of opportunity, that it's a location where you could turn sand into gold, and a place that has to defend its interests against Ottawa, who seeks to take away what Albertans have earned. So these stories aren't necessarily always true. They're stories that, just look at the stories that we've told ourselves about residential schools. But just because they're inaccurate or wrong doesn't make them any less potent. And I think that's something that, even though you might disagree with a story, it still can convey power. And that's something that I think people who are advocating for progressive change or policy change, or electric vehicles in particular, need to understand better. I wanted to share briefly some of the research that I've done while at the Smart Prosperity Institute. I did a discourse analysis of how 3 different regional industry associations spoke about electric vehicles. So I looked at all of their corporate documents from 2014 to 2020 to look at how often and in what nature did they characterize electric vehicles. And I compared three associations. Alberta's Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, based in Calgary. I compared that with Ontario's Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. And in Quebec, I compared it with their electricity association, l'Association de l'Industrie Électrique de Québec. So what I found was, some ways not too surprising, but it underscores my point that stories are important. In Alberta, with the Oil Industry Association, electric vehicles were not part of any sort of discourse. They weren't telling their membership of major oil producers about electric vehicles until the last few years, which is somewhat surprising given that nearly 3/4 of Canadian oil that's produced goes towards transportation fuels. So there's a significant potential for demand destruction of their product. Nevertheless, when they did raise it, it was often in a negative light, that this technology isn't ready, that electric vehicles aren't actually that clean if you plug them into the grids of Alberta or Saskatchewan, for instance, that the demand for oil will always be there, that we're selling into markets, we're getting pipelines to the West Coast. There'll always be demand in China for transportation fuel or bitumen. So again, these stories aren't necessarily always true. But that's what they're informing their membership about. And this is a powerful incumbent industry with powerful membership that can shape regional policy in Alberta, and also shape the views of their financial backers in Toronto and of politicians in Ottawa as well. In Quebec, it was the other end of the spectrum, where their electricity association has long seen a positive role for transportation electrification. So they've seen it as overwhelmingly a positive thing that could increase the economic competitiveness of Quebec, that it could be a source of growth for their industry, and an improvement on environmental outcomes in Quebec as well. So that's the other end of the spectrum from Alberta's oil industry. And in Ontario, there the APMA, the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, was in the middle. They weren't talking about electromobility all that often until 2016 or so, when they started to talk about the uncertainty surrounding this technology, that it's neither good nor bad, but it's going to change things a whole lot for a lot of the big incumbent part manufacturers. And then it's only been recently, really since the pandemic, maybe a few months before, that they started becoming much more positive in how they talked about the economic opportunities, for instance, from electromobility. So that's been a change that's been quite recent within the APMA. So these are different stories or storylines that are tracing through these different industry associations. However, there's also other stories that are out there. There's new stories and untold stories about electric vehicles. The dominant ones, at least within EV consumers, and perhaps within the Electric Vehicle Society. I haven't done that analysis yet, but it's that electric vehicles are amazing technology. They're just superior to operate compared to a combustion vehicle, and that they help the environment. So environmental norms and norms around early technology adoption play a key role. But there's also other untold stories, perhaps, around the cost savings around electric vehicles, that it gives me more money, but also more time, because I don't have to spend that time in a lineup for getting gasoline anymore, or scheduling my maintenance, because there's hardly any that needs to be done. There's also ways that you could link stories around electric vehicles to old stories to sort of leverage the power of those stories to harness that in some ways. It could be linking to stories around resilience or adaptation or a clean environment or what have you. And these can be regionally specific or specific to different parts of that big asterisk that I was showing you a few slides ago. It's also important to consider the storytellers who are telling the stories. It's one thing for Elon Musk or David Suzuki to talk about the amazing potential of electric vehicles, but it's another thing for other cultural or corporate icons, business icons in Canada, whether it's the CEO of the major banks or Shopify talking about electric vehicles, or someone like Wayne Gretzky or some pop culture star like Drake talking about his electric vehicle collection. You saw that in the GM's ad for electric vehicles during the Super Bowl this year, right? They used Will Ferrell, a very mainstream comedian in Hollywood, for especially millennials, to show how hip and current and amazing electric vehicles are, and that GM's leading the way. That's the story that they wanted to use, and the storyteller that they chose. There's also venues as well. Where are you telling your story? GM chose the Super Bowl ad, but you could also choose other locations like the parking lot of a Tim Hortons, or hockey arenas, or the parking lot of your local church or mosque. So these could be venues for different stories that you could tell about electric vehicles, that it doesn't have to happen within the garage of Bill Gates or the founder of Hewlett Packard tinkering away with their electronics to be able to develop this technology. It's something that has a much broader appeal potentially. So this imagery is powerful. It has political power, and that's why you see it in the ads for the Ford F-150 or GM's announcement for an electric Hummer. These are values that are different than what values have been expressed in the past around a Nissan Leaf or a Prius. We're talking about models that show strength or utility. So these also convey a different story, and that's something that OEMs know very well. The big ones know very well, but it's something that other policy actors, political actors pushing forward electric vehicles also need to understand as well. So there's some untapped potential there, in my opinion. So these stories, their storytellers, venues, and imagery can become the fuel or accelerant for coalitions. They become the fodder for coalitions. And when people think about coalitions, they often think, and rightly so, about development coalitions. These are the teams of industry associations, companies, and political parties that often work hand in hand. They're the offensive linebackers that get the job done. But you need to realize that there's other players on that team, and that there's other teams out there that can potentially upset the game. So it's important to understand who's convertible, who are the players in this development coalition that can be changed. It may be impossible, quite frankly, to change the minds of big oil companies when it comes to the speed of technology or the readiness of technology, of electric vehicle technology, but it is possible, as we're seeing now, to start converting some of these formerly recalcitrant OEMs. So there is change that can be possible from those convertible entities, but there can also be some lost causes as well. And there's insiders versus outsider. Who are the ones that are firmly entrenched within the middle of these coalitions, and others who are playing on the outside, who could potentially join forces with other electric vehicle coalitions, like the Electric Vehicle Society. So there's it's also important to know about regional dynamics as well, and these can play to your advantage or your disadvantage. The stories that resonate in Quebec might not have any sort of potency in a place like Alberta, or they actually may be harmful, depending on the politics at play and the region. It really depends on, again, who's the venue, who's the messenger, and what's the particular message, what's the story that's being played out here. So it's important to keep those all aligned. And sometimes these things are natural, you know, they're intuitive, but other times they're not. And it's important to have these sort of rubrics or heuristics, these different shortcuts for ways of analyzing, reading the politics of a particular situation. So knowing the political field, who's convertible, who's lost causes, and having a sort of in the back of your head this understanding of stories can help you to build coalitions. So there's different ways that you could unite stories with coalitions, and these are three different approaches that I've suggested. One's using your existing membership. So for instance, your existing membership within the Electric Vehicle Society. This is an easy lift. You folks are already organized, and you already have relationships and connections with other networks, with policymakers, potentially other private companies, perhaps. So that's a membership that's already activated, and perhaps it could be informed with a new story. But there's also other existing memberships that you as individuals hold. Going back to that asterisk diagram and the many Canadas, perhaps there's other affiliations that you have with service clubs or with linguistic or ethnic or religious communities that could be leveraged to help build coalitions. There's other coalitions that stand out, these so-called Baptist and bootlegger coalitions, where these two people who would not want to be in the same room together, the Baptist preacher and the organized crime leader, but they both succeed if there's a prohibition out there. So there's other ways where you could bring together people with diverse backgrounds, diverse interests, but shared positions on a certain policy item, perhaps, to capture attention and to turn heads. And that's something that's important, especially when the policy conversation starts getting stale. I don't know if we're there yet with electric vehicles, but in my experience, talking about pipelines or oil sands in Canada, it's really tired. And to have those unconventional allies can be helpful. There's another way to go at it, which is also seeking mainstream coalition partners. And this is important because it helps to signal popular and market demand. So to be able to have as a venue or as a partner, somebody like Tim Hortons. Imagine if Tim Hortons, for instance, started installing a network of electric vehicle charging stations across its thousands and thousands of parking lots in the country. It's similar to the current modest attempt by Canadian Tire to do it. That's a very mainstream institution. A lot of people shop at Canadian Tire. And it's something that's not politicized. It cuts across regardless of your political affiliation or the many Canadas that you're from. A lot of people shop at Canadian Tire. So how to get those sorts of institutions involved is a good nut to crack, to try and crack. And that could be, you could also do it as around Canada's love of hockey or other sorts of sports, perhaps, is something that often cuts across traditional cleavages in society that you find. So if I could go to the next here, I talked about I spoke about several approaches to coalitions. Once you bring this together with the stories, you could equip the coalitions with power. That's, again, I said it's the fuel or the accelerant for coalition building. And these coalitions, as I mentioned earlier, creates these virtuous circles, these positive feedback loops where if you have constituencies that are benefiting from electric vehicles or feel that they're a part of this story or part of this coalition, they want to advocate for it, for the maintenance of existing policies or the expansion of other policies. And in turn, they become positive allies for other coalition building efforts. So you could see this in the promotion of electric vehicles in rural areas. That's a big thorny challenge in a big place like Canada, where there's not a lot of model offerings right now in that services rural areas. But there's other ways, until we're waiting for the F-150 to come out, the electric F-150. There's other ways to help seed those coalitions to advocate for policies that are relevant for rural Canadians. So it could be talking about the equivalent of purple gas, but for electricity. the dyed gas that you get for farms that allows them to have discounted fuel supplies for their tractors or farm machinery. Perhaps there's an equivalent for electricity for farms to help electrify their operations. Or you could talk about targeted charging infrastructure for rural areas, or additional purchase incentives for rural residents. These are all things that are somewhat talking about, the different policy actors are somewhat discussing, but to be able to package it into a coherent story for why rural Canadians should jump on this bandwagon of vehicle electrification is something that I think still hasn't been really approached in any sort of concerted manner yet, but it's promising. And the same could be done for lower income communities as well. Often there's an overlap with rural Canada, but there's specific needs for urban lower income communities as well that electric vehicle promoters can incorporate into their stories to get these folks on board and to have them better more involved in the story to help really expand also the market for electric vehicles. It helps to hasten it for everyone. I was looking through some preliminary polling data that Smart Prosperity did with University of California's in Davis, their Institute for Transportation Studies. And they surveyed Canadians last year in Toronto and Vancouver about what's their likelihood of purchasing a new EV. These were lower numbers overall compared to KPMG's, but it was at a much earlier stage. I think 2 years seems a long time ago when it comes to electric vehicles. But what was interesting for me and somewhat surprising was that if you segment out the Canadian population by income and age, it was older Canadians over 55 and people who are lower income, lower than $50,000 annual income, who are the most likely, they said, to want to purchase an electric vehicle going forward. And these are populations which are large and influential, but they're not often what policymakers or perhaps OEMs think of when they think of EV buyers. They think of people who are still in the wage economy, high income earners who are younger, who aren't necessarily in the older set. But that shows, I think, that there's some potential untapped allies within Canada that could be used to help advance the electric vehicle story. So for my last slide, I wanted to ask you as EV Society members to consider what are the stories you're telling and to whom, and are there better stories out there that could be told? And would those existing stories or these new ones be able to build new and diverse coalitions? Would they be able to strengthen existing coalitions? And would they be able to give a voice to the marginalized people in society and to the different sort of branches of that asterisk to make sure that this transition is as broad and as just as possible? And I think once you start thinking about these stories more intentionally, you could start to build them into your existing engagement work that you do, and in the different work that you do as individuals, even outside of the Electric Vehicle Society. So that was my talk, which focused mostly on the stories, the ideas, and coalitions around the politics of electric vehicles. But there's a lot of other, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of other aspects around electric vehicle politics out there, and I'm happy to discuss those as well. So thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Nathan. I'm going to pass it now over to Jason Arnaud. Jason, I think we have some questions to field.
Yes, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Nathan. Just a reminder, you can type your questions into the Q&A box. We have just a few, so if you'd like to add some more while we're going through these first few questions, please feel free.
Hey, Jason, I think it would be nice if we stop the screen share here, Nathan, so that we can actually see moving heads instead of a fixed picture for the next little bit. Thank you. Excellent.
Okay. First questions from Michael. How will major national investments in the US in EV rebates and charging infrastructure affect Canada's policies, both federally and provincially?
Great question. I think it's personally a great thing to be able to grow the electric vehicle market in the US as well as in Canada. You know, many of you know the extreme integration of Canada's auto sector with the US auto sector, and how many times you know, the parts for a single vehicle cross the US Canadian border. You know, the investmts that's triggered in the US to manufacture more electric vehicles will help to create strong, you know, strong auto parts suppliers here in Canada, but it also helped to create that market, especially if you're talking about those charging infrastructure or purchase incentives, etc. It'll help to create a market which will help Canada to prosper, and it'll also create opportunities for policy learning here north of the border as well. And you see that a lot of the times between, quite closely between California and Quebec, where it could be a you know, particular fuel economy standards, could be purchase incentives, could be carbon trading, could be zero emission vehicle mandates. Quebec is picking up on policy advances that are happening in America's most advanced jurisdiction in this matter, at least for policy, all the time. So if you start seeing other innovation happening within other states or even federally, that's great. And those policies will start to diffuse north of the border as they become more and more normal, that politicians realize, oh, we don't have to take a huge risk here because we know that other people have gone before us.
Okay, thank you. The next question from Terry. Should municipal government invest in public charging stations? If so, then how can they overcome the reluctance for expenditures that are viewed as not uniformly beneficial for all taxpayers?
That's a good question. And I think some of it is a technical answer, which requires expertise that I don't have. It depends on the particular electricity market and who's providing electricity in your area, whether they have the ability to be able to install charging facilities like that, if it's under a provincial mandate or if it's under a municipal mandate or a private company potentially. But there's a strong precedence in a host of services that municipalities provide that are targeted to certain populations. You could say that about swimming lessons. You could say that about schools. Why invest money in schools? People who are over 18 don't benefit from them. Why are you investing in you know, roads in the center of town when I live in the suburbs? There's a lot of these, you know, so-called, as economists call them, club goods that have somewhat excludable benefits when it comes to electrification. But I think if it's to push towards broader acceptance, there's justification for it. Just like you could pay for, municipalities can pay for recreation facilities because they want to promote active living and a healthy and happy population. And I think the same could be said for electrification. Now, whether the province has the resources, that's a challenge, right? You see that very starkly in Ontario versus Quebec, and Alberta, for that matter, because municipalities in Canada constitutionally are an entity of provinces. Provinces control a lot of the powers that individual municipalities can have in terms of revenue raising. And electric vehicle charging infrastructure is expensive. And especially if you're putting in on-street charging, public charging facilities, you're having to rip up a lot of infrastructure and put some expensive infrastructure down. So to be able to justify that requires having a strong coalition pushing for it, to get back to a little bit to my talk. And that's been easy to do in a city like Montreal, where you've had for well over a decade alignment at the municipal level and the provincial level, a really consistent policy signal that's sent to municipalities that says, we'll be a partner on this. We'll help fund your electric buses. We'll help fund your on-street charging. We'll rally the forces of and the great borrowing capacity of Hydro-Québec to install circuit électrique in Quebec. But can that be said in Alberta or Ontario? No, Ontario's it's, as many of you know, has gone up and down, and it's been really difficult for people within municipalities to know whether or not the provincial government's going to be a strong partner. And in the case of Alberta, with a mild exception of the Notley government, it's been completely missing in action for electric vehicle policies, or policies that support municipal electrification. So that creates a disproportionate burden on municipalities to shoulder that risk, and that's sometimes, it's too heavy for the politicians, and understandably so, to handle in that environment.
I have to jump in with my own little editorial. We can't forget about the benefits that everybody receives in terms of healthcare costs. That's something that I don't care what side of the 401 you live on, you're going to benefit from reduced health costs.
Absolutely. It reduces local air pollutants, and it also reduces noise, which reduces mental stress as well. People are able to sleep better. They're able to not be as distracted, have a better quality sleep, or a more relaxing time when they're awake, if they're near traffic that's electrified.
Great. And I have a related question. Are utilities not obvious partners in all of this?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and they're part of development coalitions. They want to expand their revenue sources. They want to expand the number of people that are using electricity, usually, which is why it's easier for them to on their own to back electric vehicle charging facilities than it is for them to back energy efficiency programs, because sometimes it's easier. It creates a better business case. Although now when you look at energy efficiency and it reducing the potential for very expensive power generation or distribution, there's an increasingly strong case on that side as well. But yes, utilities can be a powerful partner, and you're seeing that. You're seeing folks like Toronto Hydro partner with the city of Toronto to have on-street pilot charging, which is great. They have a very modest number of EV on-street chargers, which is good. Hydro-Québec and Montreal did that ages ago, and there's lots of evidence from other places in the world with like cities like Oslo, where there's thousands of on-street charging poles for people to use, where that show the sort of potential that can happen when you have alignment of these two key actors, right? The municipality and the utility. But it's until you can get a business case for EVs for utilities, that's hard to convince them, right? In Quebec, the provincial legislature had to pass a special bill to allow Hydro-Quebec to run its EV charging network line, the electric circuit, at a loss, so that it could. I think the logic was that it would generate longer term growth and demand for it. So they were able to have this as a loss leader, as a sort of low cost banana if you're in a grocery store, to get people in the door of vehicle electrification. But it's a state-owned enterprise, right? And it has patient shareholders. You can't say that necessarily for folks in an electricity market like Alberta that's privatized, right? You see it with BC Hydro. They're also in advance of a lot of other privately owned utilities in the country, because they could put in take the financial hit, whereas other companies can't convince their board of directors, their shareholders, to make that sort of guess. So you just are stuck in this holding pattern of these small little pilot programs, and it's not able to scale up.
Okay, great. Here's an interesting one. To motivate charging station owners to keep them all operational, should groups like parking enforcement be assigned the role to fine owners of public charging stations for prolonged disrepair?
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, I don't see why a city can't pass a bylaw around electric vehicle charging use, right? You already are seeing that happen in places. It depends on the jurisdiction and where exactly, if it's under provincial or municipal jurisdiction. But I know even the Ford government passed a legislation that prohibited combustion engine vehicles from parking in electric vehicle charging spots. And I would assume that there could be, and other municipalities have done that. Toronto's done that before the Queen's Park. But you could have other sorts of that style of bylaws or provincial legislation, I would imagine, for ensuring that this infrastructure is maintained. I think it depends on who's the owner and how much power they have in City Hall or provincial legislatures as well.
Next one is, they've just moved around on me. I find electrification of transportation to be in conflict with climate change. It will help reduce CO2 and CH4 emissions, but it can contribute to urban sprawl and drive more emissions. What's the story there?
Sorry, you were breaking up a little bit, Jason, at the beginning. Is the gist of the question is that the person understands how the sort of environmental argument when it comes to reducing GHG emissions, but it could also potentially promote sprawl, and what's my thoughts on that? Is that the basic gist?
Yeah, it can promote sprawl and conversely increase emissions rather than decrease them.
Absolutely, 100%. And I agree with this person, whoever they are. That's something that some governments have a better handle on in Canada than others. And any sort of push for electrification of personal transportation, private vehicles, needs to be teamed with electrification and just expansion of existing, even if it's combustion powered public transit and active mobility. And luckily, even during the pandemic, we've seen the federal government come out with substantial, historically unprecedented amount of funding from infrastructure Canada for active mobility. We're seeing unprecedented numbers of Canadians taking to the roads to walk, to bike, and or scoot along, depending on what's their mode of choice, or their choice mode of transport. And public transportation. Very few people are taking public transportation these days, but there's been significant provincial and federal funding announcements over the past 2 years for expansion of electric buses, and also light rail in practically every major Canadian city. We haven't seen this amount of building of light rail in Canada, I would say, since the 60s or 70s. I don't know for sure, but it's certainly not in my lifetime. So those sorts of policies to promote other forms of transportation alongside the electrification of private transport, private vehicles, is absolutely essential, because you won't, because all it will improve will be, like I mentioned before, the noise, the local air pollution will be reduced. That's great. That'll ease the burden on our healthcare system. But it'll make, it won't solve traffic congestion. It might encourage people to travel further to get to housing that they could afford, right? This is where the transportation crisis that we're facing right now is deeply connected to the inequality crisis and the housing crisis that Canada is facing, not just the climate crisis. There's no shortage of crises. And I think federal policymakers are understanding that right now, and provincial politics, it really varies depending on the province that you go to, whether or not they see these things as related. Sometimes, in the case of Alberta, they hold up funding for public transportation, like the Green Line in Calgary, as a political bargaining chip for other sorts of completely unrelated policy asks that the government may have in Ottawa.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, I understand that Tesla is looking at opening up their charging structure for all vehicles. How will this affect the growth of our overall charging infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a good question. Personally, I think that there's such a high degree of sort of satisfied demand for electric vehicles, if you believe the polling numbers that I cited earlier, that there's such a shortage of electric vehicles and such a huge amount of Canadians who would be willing to buy it, and the price is starting to make sense for a lot of folks now, that given the relatively low number of public chargers that we have, if you open up another new network towards public charging, that'll further accelerate the transition. It's not like it's going to swamp Canada with electric vehicle chargers. It'll, if anything, it'll increase the competition between networks. Maybe it'll lower the price for electricity that you pay between different networks to help encourage some friendly competition. But I don't think it's a bad thing if that's what the person was intimating in his question.
Okay, we have a related charging question. Canada's charging infrastructure is occurring east to west, northern, remote, and rural areas being left out. How can small towns afford to participate?
Well, as it stands now, they can't. So they need assistance. They need technical assistance, and because they're very under-resourced in a lot of cases, and they need financial assistance because they're stretched in that way as well. So I think having funding that's targeted towards those jurisdictions is key. And there's some of that. You know, Natural Resources Canada has some earmarked money that's for rural electric vehicle charging stations. Is that enough? Absolutely not. And is that the places where you should be prioritizing? I think yes. Like those are the places where Tesla would be the least likely to put in, or the private sector would be least likely to risk their money to put in, because it's harder to make money. It's the same rationale with allowing trying to get inter-regional bus lines in Canada as well. There's so many rural regions that it's difficult to make a profit with inter-regional buses in some rural areas, yet they're absolutely essential for how folks get around in those regions, especially if you're of modest means. So being able to, for governments have traditionally handled that by either having a provincially owned or sometimes federally owned transportation service. Could be via rail in northern Manitoba at one point in time, or it could be provincially owned bus lines, or it could be through concessions that are given where the government tops up something so that they get investors get a fair rate of return on installing their, you know, in this case, electric vehicle charging network. So there's different ways in which I think policymakers could help get those charging networks out there. But if you're trying to help get those rural or northern Canadians on board with vehicle electrification, if you're trying to help encourage tourism to those regions from the south, from electric vehicle owners, then that's a great way to do it.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to jump in and put up the flag. We're just about out of time, so I'll have to stop the questions there, but that was terrific. Thanks, Jason. And of course, thank you, Nathan. That was very, very interesting. It really gave a different perspective, I think, at least for me, on the politics and the policies and how they evolve. Quick story, you know, my career was in the beverage alcohol industry, which explains a lot, I guess, about what I'm doing here. But in that role, during my career, I was involved in dealing with liquor boards and liquor commissions across the country. And I must say, it was always something akin to dealing with a different country when you went from one province to another. But, you know, when you talk about storytelling and coalitions a bit too, I realize now that a lot of the policies and politics have a personality that reflect the province and the people in that province. And you can, now that hearing you talk about that, I can see how some of that evolved. It's why perhaps Alberta is the only officially privatized liquor board in Canada. It comes from their roots and their manner of thinking. So anyway, thank you for that. I think you also, you know, you make some good points about what we could do in terms of strengthening the EV society and its connection with other organizations. It's a lot harder to do than to say, but nevertheless, that's work that needs to be done. And I think you make that quite clear. And one comment on traffic congestion, I'm counting on vertical takeoff and landing vehicles to help us by the time the electrification technology evolves to the point where congestion becomes a problem on the roads. Maybe we won't be on the roads quite as often. So anyway, with that, I'll thank you again and really appreciate you coming on today. Yeah, so let me say that, and thanks again, Jason, for doing the Q&A. That was a great job, as always. In our next episode of the webinar, we had planned to provide a glimpse into Magna International, the world's largest car parts manufacturer. Tom Rucker, president of Magna International Powertrain, he's keen to come on and discuss the challenges and the opportunities surrounding that major transition from conventional to electric powertrains. But we learned just today that there's been some breaking and exciting news for them, specifically that LG and Magna have entered a joint venture agreement in order to expand the powertrain electrification market. And so for that reason, Tom's presentation is going to be pushed back by a month or two so that we'll be able to get the full story about this important development. So next month's speaker will be announced very shortly. We're just finalizing the details. You can appreciate it's been less than a day that we've had to make that change. But I think we've got someone who on the slate who will be getting very technical on the car side of things. For those of you who want to get some, I don't want to say grease under your fingernails, but you get my meeting. We'll get into breakdown how EVs tick. So for the rest of you, thank you all for joining us on today's episode. And as always, from all of us at Electric Vehicle Society, and until next month, please stay safe and stay healthy. This concludes tonight's webinar.